Welcome back to Everyday Leadership, the go to space for all things entrepreneurship and leadership. Today, we are embarking on a deep dive into the realm of user research with a seasoned expert. In this episode, we will unravel the intricacies of selecting the right participants, dissecting valuable insights from the noise, and ensuring our conclusions are not just data points but actionable strategies. Our guest today brings a wealth of experience in overcoming biases and fostering genuine empathy with users. Whether you are a first time entrepreneur or a seasoned researcher or someone just curious about the magic behind user centric design, you're in for a treat. So adjust your volume, hit play, and let's explore the fascinating world of user research together. When it came to user research, I cannot think of anyone but Jan Vishnupolsky. He's somebody who had spent a lot of time figuring out the right way of researching users, and his insights are going to tremendously help all those entrepreneurs who are trying to figure out how to really understand if there is a need for their product. And if there is a need, how to really understand how does that need really shape into a product. With that, so let me introduce Jan Vishnupolsky. Jan, so why don't you quickly introduce us, give us a quick introduction, um, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. I have been a founder of my own UX agency, and from that perspective, I've worked as a UX generalist for the first about 8 years of my career, and then after that, I've been working as a UX research leader, uh, mostly leading user research teams in various large organizations like Ford, JP Morgan Chase, and so on. But oftentimes, I'm working for these organizations in small companies because I'm working for them through a small agency. And so I get basically a large range of experience from startups to large companies in UX research environments. Oftentimes, these large companies are also launching products as well. So I'm familiar with how you can launch a product from a user research standpoint.
Let's try to keep this conversation very focused for the purpose of the audience. So we'll try to understand how do you really go about researching the need for your product. And when I say that, as an entrepreneur, let's say if I want to build a product, how do I know if there is a need for the product? And every book on startup tells me to go talk to the users first. Now that is a very vague question, and when people say that, I would generally take it with a pinch of salt, because it doesn't really clarify how do you identify the right users. Because if you end up choosing a wrong set of users, then you will pretty much end up in a slippery slope where everything after that is absolutely meaningless and waste of time. So let's talk about how do you select the right set of users for a product.
So there's a couple facets to that. Number one is that um, you should we should start with an understanding of what is qualitative research versus quantitative research. Quantitative research is a form of research which you look at users en masse and try to understand what is happening in the general population, or at least the trends. And when we're talking about this particular scenario, we're mostly talking about qualitative research. And that's an important prism through which to look at this question, because for qualitative research, we don't need as many users. And that's very important because we don't want to be blowing a lot of money for startups. We want to get really good ROI for our research. Startups don't have a lot of money to play around with. And so anything that we do, we really need to focus on the impact. And so the right number for a kind of study like this of participants can range from anywhere from 5 to 7. Anything more than that, I feel like would be overkill. You could use more than that in like more advanced settings, like where you have more money to play around with. But if you really want bang for your buck, like 5 to 7 is enough. And you usually want to keep it an odd number, because when you trying to draw insights, you don't want to have like an insight that's split down the middle where you say like 3 users say this versus 3 users say that. That's not really conclusive. Whereas if you have 7 users, then you could say like 4 users say this versus 3 users say that, and so it's less likely to be split down the middle on a particular insight. And the kinds of research that you want to be doing are mostly interviews, either interviews or if you're working remotely, where you're asking people questions and you're not showing them anything. Or you could go and shadow those users, and that's called contextual inquiry. Now, I highly recommend that you hire, speaking to the audience, I highly recommend that you hire a specific user researcher for this task because there's difficulties in knowing how to go about this sort of research. Like it's a very specialized field, and generally for any kind of research outside of user research, you need like a PhD. In our field, not having a PhD is okay, but it's really good to have lots of experience under your belt when you're approaching this, so that you know the intricacies. But coming to the question and coming to the point, I think that knowing your audience is really important, and knowing the kind of problem that you're trying to solve with your product is really important. And then on top of that, avoiding any forms of bias. So it might be easy to select people that you know well, and then ask them to be participants in your research. But that is a kind of bias in itself, because that's selection bias. You're only selecting the kind of people that you know, and it's not really going to give you the most diverse audience. Rather than doing that, what I suggest is going to a platform like user interviews or usability testing, and getting your participants from there. Because it's a platform and it's at scale, it will be relatively cheap. This will work unless you need really specific participants for a specific area. Then you'll have to pay more for that. But for the most part, going to a platform like user interviews or usability testing or something similar will give you cheap participants, impactful research, and you will get the kind of results that you're looking for the most part.
Awesome. And when you talk to these users, when you interview them, every user will respond to your questions obviously in a different way because they're unique human beings and they have a
Right.
certain state of context. So there's a lot of factors that influence what in terms of how they would respond to your questions. My next question is, once you interview all these users, how do you cut through all the fat that they might be giving you, and how do you really steer the conversation in a certain way? Can you elaborate on cutting through the fat aspect of these interviews?
Yeah. So basically, in this case, you need to be careful when you're cutting out the fat, because you don't want to cut it out insights which could be useful. Sometimes what happens when you're a more experienced user researcher is that you encounter things that you would have skipped over because you thought like, that's not really useful. But then when when you look at multiple interviews that people are referring to a particular topic in a different way each time, then you realize that it's not really fat, that there's something buried in that insight which is important. I've had that happen to me numerous times in my career. And so when you're throwing things out, you want to make sure that you're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. You want to make sure that you're actually capturing the accurate information. But when at the same time, you want to make sure. So when you're pursuing a research or research project, you want to have a research plan before you go in, and so that means having research goals. And those goals should be, as a user researcher, you should be aligning with your the owner of your startup, and making sure that everyone's on the same page when you're setting up that plan and setting up those goals. To that end, that kind of brings us to answering your question, which is when you're cutting out the fat, you want to make sure that what you're cutting out relates to the does not relate to the goals. And if it relates to the goals, then you want to keep it. If it doesn't relate to the goals, then it might be interesting, but it might not be worth addressing in your report.
And obviously, so there's you know there is a clear gap in what you listen and what you understand, right? So when someone is answering the questions or giving you some content, and your ability to grasp through the content is also slightly different from person to person, because there's plenty of bias that gets in the way of analyzing things that are being thrown at you. So can you elaborate in terms of how can you manage bias when you are interpreting the answers given by the users?
Well, the most important thing is to be aware of the different kinds of forms of bias. Like, for instance, earlier in this conversation, I mentioned selection bias. In addition to bias and being aware of the different kinds, so that you can think about them when you're approaching your data. So, I highly recommend if you're getting into user research, that you memorize the different forms of bias, so that way when you see them, you immediately like click. It'll click with you. Oh, this is this kind of bias, or oh, that's that kind of bias. The other thing with bias is that you can never get rid of it. Like, there's always going to be some element of it. So what you can do is, instead of getting rid of it, you can make a note of it, that this study was biased in this particular way, and then we managed to reduce the bias by taking a note of that and mitigating that. And so when you like write it down and you note it, that drastically reduces the impact of the bias just from noting it down and being mindful of it in the first place. Um, Getting rid of bias is inherently an expensive activity. And considering that a lot of our listeners are um, startups, there's going to be a limit to how much they can get rid of the bias. But mitigating the bias is something that definitely I recommend people do. And then on top of that, and another important thing closely related to bias is confounding variables. And so you want to make so confounding variable is something that affects both what you're uh, studying and the question that you proposed. And so, like, it could be something that impacts both sides of the equation, and then then you end up distorting the study in a different way. The effects will be closely similar to bias, because you won't be able to uh, understand your results as much, and you won't be able to rely on them as much. But it's worth considering both. And I think that confounding variables are often less expensive to mitigate than bias in terms of like dollar values. And so I would chase confounding variables first, and then bias second. And then, of course, I'm not saying like bias is good, but just like try to be reasonable about like how you're going to encounter bias and how we deal with it. It's not an academic environment, far from it. Nor are we talking or referring to big companies here, because they will have more money to play with to eliminate the bias. But in the case of like launching a new product or a new startup, you have to kind of be reasonable.
Awesome. I like that. Being mindful of the fact that there will be bias, I think is interesting. Um, all right. So far, we've chosen the right set of users to talk about. So we know, the number of users that we want to talk to, the odd number that you mentioned, and then we know how to cut through the fat, and then we know how to be mindful of the bias. And now we are at a stage we've spoken to all the users and we have all their answers. Now, how do you build empathy from what they've said to you? Like, how do you deeply understand their need from here? Are there frameworks, or generally how would a typical user researcher approach the empathy side of it?
So I find that we're like in the business world, like yeah, there's how we user researchers talk about empathy, and empathy is really important. But then in the end, what we're talking about here with our audience is a cross-functional team, where someone like me would be just one member of that team, and we have to find a way to make other people relate to this. And ultimately, what everyone always cares about is money. And so empathy is I think when you're talking to a cross functional team, is closely related to ROI and stuff like that. Because if you can tell your cross functional team that if we don't make an effort to fix a particular problem that the users are facing, that our product will be impacted and will make less profits, that's a really powerful argument for empathy. And ultimately, money is what people care about, particularly at the startup stage. Like, every dollar counts, and particularly in terms of like getting our money back from whatever investment we're making. We really want to make sure that that happens, and that the way that we're investing our time and money is safe. And so, if empathy can help with that, that becomes a really powerful argument for empathy.
Nice. And how do you draw conclusions? Like, if you can throw some example, that would be awesome. But once you
Yeah.
have once you're done with all the interviews, and once you have all the content, now how do you sit and draw conclusions from it, so you can really understand in the end, what do these users really want.
Okay. So this answer will differ based off of the kind of research that you're doing, but I'm going to keep this in terms of what we've been discussing so far, which is qualitative interviews with a small number of participants that could be done remotely or on site. And in that case, um, what you want to look at is what do the majority of the users say? Where do they disagree? Because sometimes will be disagreements. And in terms of disagreements, is there a way that you can satisfy for both groups of users? Like if let's say you have five participants and two participants say one thing and three participants say another, that's a fairly significant group of people who disagree. If you're just going to target the 3 out of 5 and you're not going to think about the 2 out of 5, that means that a certain percentage of your audience, a good chance, will be disappointed when your product gets released, and you don't want that, right? Like you want to make sure that 5 out of 5 people are happy if possible, and so what that's called is satisficing. So you make a design or a recommendation that satisfies it's targeted towards the three, but satisfies the other two. So the other two users in this example would have a way to go. Or let's suppose another scenario where there's people say one thing and one person says another thing, and then another person says a third thing. You can still find ways to satisfy. If you're clever and you're creative, you can find ways to satisfy everybody. It's just like figuring out the balance in the design, and that's where you need a good designer. So
Nice.
researchers,
And
designers, we're all like an important part of the team.
nice. And is there a way to validate once we draw the conclusions? Right. We spoke to a bunch of audience, and then we drew some conclusions out of all the conversations. Now, doing another round with similar set of
Yes,
users and cross validating that. So would that create an additional mode in terms of the understanding of the user need?
I would recommend something different. We discussed bias earlier,
Hmm.
and we discussed how bias would is always going to be a factor. And so, if you correctly have identified the bias in your study, then you basically know the limitations of your study. And so, um, rather than keeping harping on on doing another study, because that's not good. What you're not going to achieve what you're looking for. What you're looking for if you're doing that is statistical validity. For statistical validity, you need a quantitative study. You need a survey. You need analytics or some combination of those. You maybe need a quantitative user test. All of these are different kinds of quantitative research, and it's not going to help because you're just going to get another group of five, and they might tell you a different set of things, but you won't know whether you still addressed the body audience, and you won't know unless you've used some statistical method. So rather than doing that, I recommend tackling the bias instead. So find a way to do a different form of research which avoids the limitations that you had in the first study. And I think that's a better way to validate the data, um,
Hmm.
or confirm. I rather like the word confirm the data rather than validate, because validate like gives like a false sense of confidence.
Hmm.
So confirm the data through another study, and then like if you have done that sort of research, um, then ultimately what happens is more good research leads to more research. And so even when you have the first study and the second study, a good researcher will find additional limitations that haven't been addressed or additional points that need to be addressed by the product. And it will be a continuous process. Just like design is iterative, product is iterative, research should also be iterative.
Nice. And from your experience as a user researcher, uh, do you have an example of an interesting story in terms of where you really made a difference for a product, and not necessarily a product for founders, but it could be for the existing users. But do you have any story that you can share
Yeah.
with the audience?
Yeah, so we were launching a product in my last job, and I can't really talk about the specifics of how how my client worked, but I can still tell you about how the research made an impact. And so the client was JP Morgan Chase, and the product that we were launching was for customer service agents for JP Morgan Chase. And so those were the users. And this was not an existing product, this was from scratch. And so before I came in on the scene, so to speak, the UX director that I was working for, he had already kind of ideated the basic approach of what the product would do um, with the product managers on the client side. And so my role was to investigate as a user researcher and see if there's further ways to improve the basic idea of the product, which would again be like a kind of a dashboard for customer service agents, and see like what sort of features would be involved. Make sure that the research practices were good, particularly because I'm a research leader. My goal was also to democratize user research. In that case, what that meant was I was working with a team of UX designers. I put in some emphasis into coaching them on user research and what made user research practices valuable in the process of doing my research. I also evangelized some form of user research that the team had not heard of before, like for instance, card sorts, which are good for information architecture. And I also tried to explain when different forms of research could be used in some cases versus others. Like in our conversation today, we've talked a lot about the impact of qualitative research and when user interviews are especially powerful. But there are times when quantitative research is useful, when research that's directed at information architecture is useful. There are other scenarios that we have not addressed in this conversation, and that's large part of what my work involved as a user research leader at this agency working for JP Morgan Chase. And at the end, we managed to launch this product for JP Morgan Chase. And within 3 months, by reducing the call handle time of the customer service agents by an average of 2 minutes per customer service agent, we managed to save JP Morgan Chase about $6 million within those 3 months.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that story. Now,
Sure.
I mean, as you can see, with all the changes in the generative AI, and I'm a bit curious, like, what is the impact of AI on user research specifically?
So this is something that my podcast discusses. I recently launched a podcast with a co-host named Lara Barbosa. Lara Barbosa comes from more of an educational background than I do. So I'm more of the leader in this conversation. She's more of the educator, and we discuss with occasional guests how AI is going to impact research. I highly recommend that our listeners to this conversation, if they could tune in to that, if you want to explore that further. But on a broad level, I'll try to answer this in brief. The speed of the work is going to drastically increase, which logically means that one researcher could do a lot more. Um, the um, the danger with going fast is that you'll end up going alone, and so that means that user researchers will need to be really good at coordinating with the team and letting people know what they're doing in advance. So having a roadmap and a strategy is very important. Having good soft skills and relationships with your team is really important, and that's going to continue to get even more important the faster user research work goes. I think that on the whole, it will have benefits and drawbacks. There will be need for employment for less user researchers in total because one researcher can do more. But on the flip side, it will be very good for businesses because um, prior to the advent of AI, user researchers were spread extremely thin and were not able to be everywhere that they needed to be. And that's going to be less of a problem going forward.
Nice. And are there any specific tools that are available, especially with all the changes in the AI? I was wondering if there are any new tools that one can leverage to conduct and analyze these research interviews.
Yes, I mean there's text generation tools like ChatGPT and Perplexity and Bard and Claude. All of these are good tools in their own way. Um, my last episode or second to last episode on my podcast discussed these tools in great detail. And then there's less obvious tools like image generation tools, which could be used to spice up reports. There's reports that capture what people are saying, so that you don't have to like have a dedicated note taker during your interviews, which is really valuable. That's something that our listeners could perhaps use. Um, and then there are more tools and more categories coming out every day. The trick is not to focus on particular tools because like this is a very startup kind of environment with AI and tools will come and go. But I think that it's going to be far more valuable to our listeners to think about where can you use AI. If you're doing a task right now and you're not using AI for it, there's probably a way that you could use AI for that task. Like basically, that's how I approached my user research work in the last project. I tried to find ways for AI for every single aspect of my work, whether it's leading a team or evangelizing research or conducting research. There was every single task that I tried to do. I tried to find a way to involve ChatGPT or another kind of AI tool in that task, and almost always I found a way to do that. And so I would advise that our listeners try to do the same thing.
Awesome. Well, I think uh, those are great answers, and I'm sure this will at least help a lot of those people who are wondering what user research is, to really help them conduct these better. Given this is such a critical and the first step in really kickstarting companies, I'm assuming this will be a great content for a lot of those entrepreneurs. But really appreciate your time, Jan, today on on this show. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Pradeep. It's been great to be here. Your questions have been very interesting, and I really hope that my answers help your audience. This is something that I struggled with a lot running my own business, and so I really empathize with your audience who are trying to conduct user research. I wish the audience the best of luck, and if anyone has any sort of questions about how to do this beyond what the episode addressed, please reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I will be happy to answer your questions.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.